This is part two of our series on George Grant, and particularly the combination or the tensions between the owl and JADIS, or between wisdom and the dynamo of the West. Part two, we're going to look at Grant and Imperial ideology, Enfolding, unfolding. What do I mean by this, and what do I mean by Imperial ideology? Underlying Imperial ideology is the emergence of liberalism. And some people say, well, what is liberalism? Didn't liberalism emerge with the Enlightenment, and Christians have to generally resist, oppose, or assimilate into the liberal perspective? Let's just go back to what are the root prejudice or principles of liberalism, where they come from, and then Grant's concerns with this imperial ideology. Liberalism, in terms of the underlying principles, tends to highlight the ideology at the level of prejudices or principles of individualism, liberty, equality, choice, conscience, and usually to some degree an open-ended view of nature. Now, where does this come from? Now, historically, many will argue this is part of the Enlightenment project, but Grant will argue no. In fact, where you get the rise of Protestantism challenging the Catholic Church, what were the principles by which they used to do that? At a formal level, they said sola scriptura. But in fact, the principles that were used was the rights of the individuals using their conscience to make choices in good faith in terms of getting back to the Bible. Often what they seen as tradition was that which prevented them from living the faith authentically and truly. So whether it's Lutheranism, whether it's the Anabaptist tradition, whether it's Calvinist Reformed tradition, whether it's the Baptists, whether it's the Quakers, there's a variety of fragments that take place in the 16th century, but they're all appealing in one form or another, either to the Bible or to their heart or to the spirit. But what underwrites and predetermines how they make these decisions are the principles of liberalism, the right of the individual in good conscience, making choices in terms of what they think leads to greater integrity. And of course, what happens when you do that, once that genie is taken out of the bottle, everyone's going to fragment in how they interpret things. And so, but was it only the Reformation that was the birth of liberalism? Grant will argue you take a step further backward. There's a philosophical tradition of voluntarism in which willing and nominalism, the individual, converge together, in which thinking and willing come together against the larger historic community. And so here we can see the roots of liberalism themselves are within late medieval philosophical thought, and formally they then spell themselves out in the rise of denominations of the 16th century. But back of that, and even more worrisome for Grant, was the notion of power and will. And so you have the rhetoric in liberalism of liberty, individuality, equality, conscience, choice. These do lead to then pluralism and fragmentation, but Grant argued, well, back of this is the danger of will and power. And you find this dilemma, he argues, even in the tensions of the Bible itself, between God is good and God is choosing, God is power and God is justice. And there is this tension in the biblical tradition, which we'll look at in the next five-minute overview of this. And so the imperial ideology, which has come to dominate the modern and the postmodern world, and really postmodernity is just an outworking of modernity in a more fragmented manner, only taking the issue of identity politics in many other directions to I choose this, you choose that, who's to say which is right or wrong. And so imperial ideologies tends to colonize other ways of knowing by saying these are the principles that almost become the Nicene Creed for the modern and postmodern world. And Grant, as a Tory, was saying, well, what may be the truths of those, but what may be the blind spots or Achilles' heels? And a critical thinker has to ask critical questions of the spirit of their age, and Grant dared to do so. Hence, he not only critiqued the American empire, but also an ideology which is built into that empire itself in the larger Western world.